Voltaire's Candide is one of the most entertaining and accessible of the great works of Western literature. It's an exceedingly funny piece of work. It's brief, it's pithy, it's short, and it's surprisingly pessimistic for a work of comedy, for a humorous work. Now, Voltaire is living in the middle of the 18th century, and he's riding the wave of the High Enlightenment. He's one of the great figures in the French Enlightenment. And what Voltaire objects to is the optimism that is associated with many thinkers of the Enlightenment. For example, Alexander Pope or Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz's theodicy attempts to do what all theodicies do, to justify God's ways to man. And he's a sort of characteristic thinker of the Enlightenment. By the time we get to Voltaire, where Voltaire wishes to argue against the idea that we're able to justify God's ways to man, that human suffering and human existence makes sense, that it's clearly a part of Providence, well, the Enlightenment is waning. In other words, we're getting to the end of the Enlightenment. It's becoming rather bitter, rather cynical, rather too self-conscious. It's lost its naive optimism that it had perhaps a century before. Now, Candide was published in 1758, and the immediate spur to writing it was the disaster that happened in Lisbon in 1755, which was a tremendous earthquake which arbitrarily killed a tremendous number of people. Now, in terms of something like Alexander Pope's idea that whatever is best, or whatever is right, or Leibniz's idea that God only sends evil and suffering into the world in order to create some greater benefit, Voltaire believes that suffering is inexplicable and arbitrary. In other words, Voltaire's God is a God that is either indifferent or non-existent. Right? Voltaire, who is known for his deism, in other words, he believes in God, apparently believes in a God that has absconded, a God that has taken off, a God that is no longer concerned with determining the fate of individual human beings. He's sort of the Voltaire's conception of God is the creator who flips the first switch, or who pushes the first domino in the causal link that generates all the rest of the universe. But after pushing that first domino, God went off and did something else. And as a consequence, we're left to our own devices, and our confrontation with the evil of this world is the theme that Voltaire wants to talk about. Now, surprisingly enough, this very serious and deep and somewhat disturbing topic is given a very humorous treatment, and this book, Candide, has a deceptive lightness of tone. In other words, it's very funny, and the tone of it is so ironic. There are ironies of diction, but also ironies of situation, ironies of plot. The ironic tone lends to it a lightness that it wouldn't have otherwise. And when you stop and try and get beneath the surface, I think you'll find that this is anything but a light book. In fact, this is a bitterly pessimistic book. This is a book that is often given to children, or not to children, but to high school students, because it's the kind of thing that clever high school students can get access to. It's 100 pages in and out. It's kind of funny. There are a few kind of mildly dirty jokes, and it's the kind of thing that entertains seniors in high school. The difficulty is that when you kind of press beneath the surface and you think about the sort of philosophical positions that are being taken, we'll find that this is a rather morbid book. In some respects, the lightness of tone and the ironies, the kind of humorous ironies that are constantly found in it, conceal a deeper pessimism. We'll talk about that when we finish up. Now, Candide, the subtitle to it is Optimism. And Voltaire is wondering, how is it you can be optimistic when every once in a while nature, for no visible reason, decides to drop the roof on everyone's head? In other words, it generates things like the Lisbon Earthquake of 1755, which kills thousands of people. How can one maintain optimism in the sense of such senseless misery? In other words, why should we believe that God's in his heaven and all's right with the world when the human condition is blighted hopes, is thwarted aspirations, is arbitrary accidental pain and misery? How is it we're going to find a way to adjust ourselves to the realities of the human condition? Voltaire thinks that Alexander Pope and Wilhelm Leibniz are on the wrong track. If you believe in a God other than the deistic God that kind of is the kind of prime mover, if you believe in a God that is truly providential, that supervises all of human affairs, then we have to give him the responsibility for what is evil in human life. And there is so much evil and so much pain in human life that we end up with a very devilish kind of God. And these sorts of optimistic constructions, which suggest that in apparent evil we really find good and we really find God's providential plan, only make the human condition less bearable. That is a way of miseducating us. And when we are miseducated to believe that this is the best of all possible worlds, which is taken directly from Leibniz, well, then we are forced to confront the fact that the world as we experience it doesn't make sense. So when there's a discrepancy between our theory and our actual experience of the world, our optimist, our would-be apologist for God's providence, ends up saying that what appears to be evil really isn't. And Voltaire thinks that that's a fundamental mistake. The Lisbon Earthquake of 1755 was real evil. It's not just apparent evil. It's not that God, manifesting himself mysteriously, has decided to do something great by killing thousands of people. In fact, this doesn't show any sign of providential plan. It appears that the world we live in is a kind of moral chaos. A very modern-sounding idea. We hear at the waning of the Enlightenment. It becomes kind of bitter, much less optimistic than it had been in the past. In a way, you can say that Candide takes up the problem of the book of Job. In other words, why do bad things happen to good people? All right? And instead of adopting a position of rigorous and inflexible faith in God's providence the way Job does, Candide, or Voltaire in this case, ends up taking the position of Job's wife. If not quite curse God and die, at least shut up and live until you happen to expire. In other words, stop suggesting that this is all for the best. That Pollyanna-ish attitude only makes things worse. So Candide, who starts out being, as his name would suggest, our innocent, naive, miseducated optimist, is ultimately going to conclude that we should cultivate our gardens, which is to say we should live without philosophizing. It is the only way that makes life bearable. Right? A kind of negative, very cynical comment on human beings' confrontation with the evil in the world. Now, let's think about the characters here, because the characters are most entertaining. First of all is Candide himself. He's a young man who lives in a castle, which is, of course, the best of all possible castles. And he encounters the best of all possible people because he has the best of all possible teachers, which is Pangloss. Pangloss, meaning all talk or all speech, right, is, in fact, all talk. Right? His wordy explanations of why everything works out for the best, and why this is the best of all possible worlds, and why this is the best of all possible coffee cups, and why he's the best of all possible naive young men, in fact, miseducate Candide. So Candide is a kind of youthful, naive figure, the image of a mal-educated youth, someone that's been brought up to be optimistic. His optimism turns out to be catastrophic. In many respects, the moral of Candide, the idea behind it, is that optimism makes the world worse, and a kind of resignation, if not quite pessimism, is the best way of adapting yourself to the moral chaos of human life. Now, in addition to Candide, we get Candide's love, Cunegonde, and she's the best of all possible women, with the exception of the fact that she's vain, faithless, opportunistic, and cruel. But this is the best of all possible vanity, cruelty, opportunism. In other words, Cunegonde has been miseducated as well. It's just that she doesn't have the attractive, virtuous qualities that Candide has, even in his naivete. She's hypocritical, she's proud, she's aristocratic, she's most of the things that Candide himself is not, with the exception of the fact that both of them have been miseducated by Dr. Pangloss. Now, Dr. Pangloss is a real study. Everything he touches goes wrong. He is a completely destructive figure, and every time he says something, you can bet that exactly the opposite is going to happen. He's constantly explaining that this is the best of all possible worlds, they live in the best of all possible castles, and that these are the best of all possible people, and as a consequence, immediately when he says that this is the best of all possible anything, some terrible misfortune befalls them. And this is designed to suggest that optimism ill prepares us to meet the challenges of life and to meet these difficulties. A kind of resignation as an alternative, that would be a far better idea. Certainly, you should shut up about what you don't understand. Whereas Pangloss, who's all talk, won't shut his mouth and insists on dogmatically adhering to this optimism throughout the course of his experiences, which are quite varied, and I'll get to the plot in a little bit. Another philosopher, in some respects the foil of Pangloss, the opposite of Pangloss, is Martin. Martin is a philosopher and theologian who encounters Candide in South America, and he is, as far as Candide can tell, the most unfortunate of men. He's been persecuted by the church, he's impoverished and wretched, he lives in Suriname and wants to get out, wants to get back to Paris, and he is exactly the opposite of Pangloss in the sense that he's a pessimistic philosopher. He always bets on the evil in human nature, and in this novel anyway, he always wins. In other words, when Martin and Candide, whenever they make a wager as to, are these people happy or is this going to work out right, Martin says, no, these people aren't happy, or no, this is not going to work out right. No, your expectations are all going to be shattered. I'm afraid your hopes are all going to be blighted. You're better off not hoping at all. And Candide says, no, I've been educated by Dr. Pangloss. That can't be right. And Martin wins every bet. All right, it's witty and wonderful. The lightness of tone is deceptive here. It's quite a pessimistic novel. Now, in addition to that, we get Cacambo. Cacambo, as a character, is useful in furthering the plot, doesn't have much of a character development, but he's a kind of faithful servant that runs important errands for Candide to move the plot along. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a beautiful 100-page novel. You'd have a kind of dreary 200-page novel. In other words, you can get away with this kind of unrestricted cynicism for about 100 pages and still have the tone be light and still have it be funny. If you had a kind of giant Teutonic 300-page dinosaur, no one would get to the end. So one of the nice parts about French culture, and French letters in particular, is they have a sense of proportion. And Voltaire also has a sense of touch in literary terms. He realizes that you can only make an argument like this within the parameters of a kind of novella, within a very short novel. There's also an old woman who is a sort of foil to Cunegonde. She's the Pope's daughter. All right, and he's really gouging away at the papacy there. Right? And she's undergone all sorts of miseries and trials. She's enslaved and raped, and one of her buttocks is cut off and eaten. She gets cannibalized. All kinds of bad stuff happens, and yet she persists in affirming this life and saying, yes, I still want to live. She doesn't have any of the optimistic ideas that Cunegonde or Candide start out with, but she represents the kind of force of human experience and the insistence and persistence and tenacity in the face of misery or unhappiness. And the final character is Poco-Curante. He's a Venetian senator who's something of an aesthete. He's an intellectual. He's very widely read. He's aristocratic. He's wealthy. And he's full of ennui. In other words, he's bored. And he's very unhappy. And he's very unhappy about the fact that the world is a kind of spiritual vacuum. I strongly suspect that Poco-Curante is meant to be autobiographical. In other words, Voltaire, who has at his disposal all the benefits of Western European culture, who has the patronage of influential political leaders, who lives a fairly easy life, who has access to the greatest works of Western culture and is one of the important figures in Western culture at the time, is somewhat jaded. He's seen a little bit too much. This is obviously the kind of book written by someone that's seen a little too much, who's had a surfeit of experience, and who can only get out the pessimism in this sort of a catharsis. Okay, those are the most important characters worth thinking about. There are a few others. There's Cunegonde's parents and Cunegonde's brother, who will be brought in later on, but they don't play especially large roles. Now, the plot. Plot is amazingly complicated for 100 pages. I mean, there's an awful lot going on there. They zigzag all across the world and find that not much changes. Blighted hopes, shattered expectations, optimism is constantly foiled, pessimism reigns supreme, the world is moral chaos. It's a sort of anti-theodicy. In other words, where Leibniz, or Milton for that matter, wished to justify God's ways to man, Voltaire intends not to justify anything because there's no justice in the world. Rather, we live in a world that doesn't make any moral sense. It's the opposite of a theodicy. God doesn't have much influence on the world. He may have started it and created it. We need him around as a kind of throw in the first baseball the way the president does at the beginning of every baseball season. But apart from that, that's all we're going to hear about God. And so he appears to be indifferent to us and to our sufferings. In other words, rather than justifying God's ways to man, what we're getting here is a statement that says God's ways cannot be justified to man. God is indifferent to us. We must take care of ourselves. And the only way to take care of yourselves is to shut up, stop talking about things you don't understand, abandon optimism, because that's for kids. The best thing you can do is to cultivate your garden. Right? A surprisingly pessimistic novel. I have some reservations about giving this to high school kids for that reason. I doubt very many of them will actually get underneath and figure out the philosophical implications, but it's extremely bitter and negative. All right, let's go with the plot. Candide lives in a castle with the Baron and his wife, and the daughter is Cunegonde, and Pangloss is their teacher. He's the court philosopher, I guess a figure meant to lampoon Leibniz. And what he does is he says, this is the best of all possible worlds. God runs things as a theodicy that we all understand and that we have good grounds for optimism. As soon as that happens, Candide happens to notice Pangloss involved in some sort of sexual tryst with one of the ladies in waiting. Having had his curiosity about sex kind of started, he and Cunegonde get involved in a kind of small sexual liaison, but since this is the best of all possible small sexual liaisons, the Baron catches them. And he gets the best of all possible kicks on the backside out of the castle. So out they go. Immediately we have this ironic downturn of events, right, where our would-be intellectual or alleged intellectual Pangloss is in fact turns out to be a rather physical, rather hypocritical figure as well as being destructive, whereas dopey Candide gets booted out on account of the fact that he doesn't know enough to separate what people say from what people do. Out he goes, and immediately, given that he's been kicked out into the best of all possible worlds, he is dragooned and conscripted into the Bulgarian army. Now, there's all kinds of subtexts in this section about the Bulgarian army. The Bulgarians or the Bulgars are fighting the Avars. The Bulgarians are meant to be the Prussians. And by calling them Bulgarian, there's a connection here in French to the idea of homosexuality. The deep text is that he's accusing Frederick the Great of Prussia of being a pederast. As I said, I have some reservations about giving this to 16-year-olds. That's the deep text here. But he gets dragged into the army and doesn't like the idea of being caught up in this miserable war that he has no interest in and no inclination towards fighting. And having been conscripted, he runs away, he gets caught, gets brought back, and instead of getting terrible mutilations done to him, they're willing just to have him run the gauntlet of 10,000 soldiers and get 10,000 stripes. And of course, he's beaten mercilessly because he gets the best of all possible beatings. He holds on to his optimism right to the end. All right, there's a war, they fight a battle, he's unable to actively participate, and because in the confusion of the battle he does manage to get away. And who does he encounter but a man covered with terrible sores? Now, you may have read the Bible before and you may remember a man covered with terrible sores. In this case, though, it's not Job. It's Dr. Pangloss, who's gotten syphilis from his sexual tryst with the lady in waiting. So now he is covered with terrible sores. I mean, again, the lampooning of optimism is unrelenting in this novel. So he finds Pangloss and says, oh my, this must be the best of all possible diseases, and this must be the best of all possible conditions for you to be in. And we're only like 10 pages into the novel, right? We're going to cover a lot of pessimistic ground here. So he brings Pangloss to the best of all possible cities where they are unable to get any kind of solace or help from other people until they meet a kind Anabaptist. And this Anabaptist, who is, of course, a member of a reviled religious sect, right, who's persecuted by both Protestants and Catholics, right, turns out to be a genuinely nice person. In other words, it's not that all the people in the world are evil. It's not that people are constantly doing unkind things. It's that there's no moral order to the world. Sometimes good things happen to good people. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. Sometimes bad people prosper. Sometimes they do badly. The world is not the deck isn't stacked against good, but rather this deck is stacked arbitrarily. The cards of life have been shuffled. God hasn't stacked the deck, and goodness doesn't necessarily get requited. So the Anabaptist, out of kind of Christian charity, which is, of course, a way of lampooning both the Protestants and the Catholics at this time, turns out to be the only really kind person in this part of the novel. He takes Candide in out of his own pocket. He pays for a cure for Pangloss's syphilis, and he says, I'd like to hire you guys, give you a chance to earn your keep. So he does. They get on board a ship, and they sail to Lisbon, which is just about to have an earthquake, right, which is going to kill everyone. Now, just outside the harbor, there's a terrible storm raging, and one of the sailors falls off the ship and is drowning. What happens? The good-natured, kind-hearted Christian Anabaptist, Jacques, reaches out and actually saves the sailor. Now, in the process of saving the sailor, all right, he himself falls in. The sailor clambers on board. Jacques, the kind-hearted, good-natured Anabaptist, is there, and the sailor never gives a second thought to him, lets him drown. See what happens to good people? There's no moral order to the world. Nice people have that happen to them. The evil sailor is, along with Candide and Pangloss, the only person that gets saved in the wreck of the ship. Good things happen to bad people. Bad things happen to good people. That's the way the world is. We have no grounds for optimism. Well, they go to Lisbon. There's been this earthquake, tremendous destruction. So naturally, the Catholic Church kicks in and decides that this destruction has been caused by heresy. So the Inquisition hunts down heretics and decides to burn them. The idea being that an infallible way of preventing earthquakes is to burn some people. So naturally, Pangloss and Candide are likely candidates for this. Wrap them up and burn them. It turns out, though, that they don't get killed. That they are saved on account of the fact that Cunegonde, who had been thought dead, well, she's back. And she happens to be she's been raped and taken into kind of concubinage by one of the soldiers. She manages to, essentially prostitute herself all the way across Europe. And of course, Candide is still in love with her tremendously. And he thinks that she's the paragon of feminine virtue. And she manages to save him by influencing whoever it is that, that has her as a concubine now. Well, Candide is saved. And what we find is that she's the concubine of two men at the same time. One is a cardinal, all right, another gouge away at the church, and the other is a Jewish moneylender, all right, a gouge at the Jews. In other words, no one comes out of this looking good, all right, except negative philosophers. Well, Candide is there, but he gets caught, in the act of being in her quarters. The cardinal comes in, Candide kills him. The Jewish moneylender comes in, Candide kills him. Now they have to take it on the lam. So what do? Candide and Cunegonde and the old woman, who's been a kind of serving woman to Cunegonde, decide that they're going to go to the New World. So they steal some jewels from the cardinal. They take off. They go to the New World. And they go to Buenos Aires. They go to Argentina. Now, in Argentina, it turns out that the military ruler of the colony takes a fancy to Cunegonde, and Candide says, it's about time for me to get out of here because the forces of law are out after me. I'm a murderer. I have to take off. So he goes to Paraguay to visit the Jesuits. The Jesuits turn out to be rapacious, evil men who are taking advantage of the kind, good-natured, good-hearted Indians. No one who claims to be holy or sanctified turns out to be at all good in this novel. Now, Cunegonde asks the old lady, what should I do? And she counsels opportunism. So do something. Go ahead, marry him. What difference does it make? If I were in your position, I would certainly never hesitate to do that. Go right ahead. So she does marry him. No problem. And Candide goes up to Paraguay, and he finds that, fortunately for us, the leader of the Jesuits there is, in fact, the brother of Cunegonde, who had been thought dead in the process of having the castle burned down. Well, he stays there a while, has a falling out with the brother, and runs away to the jungle. Captured by cannibals, savages, the epitome of enlightenment, degradation, and evil. They turn out to be pretty nice, which is kind of what you would expect. As soon as the savages find out that Candide and his servant Cacambo are not Jesuits, they say, okay, well, in that case, we're not going to eat you. We only eat Jesuits around here. They actually have it coming. So Candide and Cacambo move from the jungles of Paraguay, from the jungles of Central America, and they manage to get to El Dorado. El Dorado is the only example of utopian society here. It represents the acme of social achievement, of political order. And El Dorado is wonderful. It's it's Voltaire's idea of heaven. all right? All the people are kind. Everything is available gratis. Everyone is virtuous and are as good as human beings can ever expect to be. Science is respected, learning is pursued, wisdom and virtue reign everywhere. El Dorado is a kind of this worldly heaven. El Dorado is just wonderful. And Cacambo and Candide get a chance to go to meet the king, and the king turns out to be an ideal king. And the society turns out to be beautifully organized, and they've got all these scientific inventions and technological advantages. It's just a wonderful place. Also, the dirt in their country is gold, and the stones are gems. So this is a real nice place. The people that live in El Dorado are carefully tucked away so that they're very inaccessible, as utopias generally are. And in particular, the very few visitors they have always really liked the gold and the rocks, which the inhabitants of El Dorado really don't understand. They say, you want our mud? You want our stones? Well, look, take it with you. We got plenty. We don't really want it. These people that live without avarice, right? People that live virtuous lives. Now, this is such a wonderful place. This is such a heaven on earth. This is such an idyllic existence that Cacambo and Candide have to leave. In other words, this is a very important idea here. I think this is one of the pivotal point in the novel. If we were able ever to get to a utopian society, if we were able to actually find the good world, the perfect world, the heaven on earth that we all long for, human perversity would drive us from it. Cacambo and Candide leave El Dorado for the same reason that Adam and Eve left Eden. Right? Human perversity, the drive towards experiencing the world, is its own downfall. It requites itself, and it causes us to find even paradise intolerable. Now, if paradise is intolerable, wait and see how intolerable the world is going to turn out to be. That is one of the most perverse decisions in any novel, and it's a very, very negative indictment of the kind of questing element, the unsettled element in human nature. In other words, if you were able to get to the perfect society that you claim you want, you couldn't stand it. Human nature is such that we cannot make ourselves happy. In the long run, even getting the things we want is as unsatisfying as not getting the things we want. Now, they're in El Dorado, and they decide they're going to leave, but they ask if it's okay. They ask the king, we'd like to take off, and he says, well, look, I think that's stupid. From what I've heard about the rest of the world, I don't know why you want to go, but okay. You want to take some mud and stones with you? Okay. Everybody that comes here wants to leave takes mud and stones, and I don't know what the problem is with you people. Must be some lack of them where you come from. And he also takes some red sheep with him, which are kind of an entertaining oddity, and packed up the inhabitants of El Dorado, being the kind people they are, and being the highly sophisticated technological people that they are, find a way for Cacambo and Candide to get out. And they lose some of the treasure on the way, but they have a substantial amount of it. And they end up in the Dutch colony of Suriname, Central America. And what happens is that they try and find passage back to Europe. Now, at first, of course, they're defrauded. As soon as they go back to the regular elements in the world, the first thing that happens is the fool and his money are soon parted, and Candide puts most of his treasure on board ship where he's been told he's going to get passage, and instead the captain decides, I'm just going to take off. Smart move, right? He gets to take off with the red sheep, he gets to keep the gold dust, he gets to keep the gems. It's just wonderful. Candide still has kept a few dollars around for his own personal use, and when he sees that go out, he says, I've left El Dorado. There goes my treasure. I know where I am now. I'm back in the real world. And he decides that he's going to try and make this the best of all possible worlds. He has a kind of charitable streak. Candide is basically a sympathetic character. And he says, I'm going to look around here in Suriname for the most wretched person I can find, for the person who is the most unhappy. So he has a kind of unhappiness contest. And of course, there's plenty of that to go around, so there's a long line of unhappy people out his door. Again, another rather negative comment about the status of the human, or the human condition itself. Well, he finally settles upon Martin. Remember our pessimistic philosopher? Martin says, well, I'm a searcher after truth. I've done my best to be religious and to be virtuous, and as a consequence of that, I've been constantly hounded by the Inquisition, and they're going to kill me as soon as they get me. Here I am, I'm poor, I'm wretched, I'm stuck in this godforsaken place, which is very definitely not El Dorado. And if you want to start a kind of wretchedness or misery contest, I'm your man. I definitely win that. So Candide says, okay, I'll pay for you to come back. You'll be my new guide. Now that I've lost Pangloss and Cacambo has gone down to South America to get Cunegonde for me, I guess you're the right sort of companion for me. So with his remaining money, he pays for their passage to Paris. Now on the way across the Atlantic, remember that ship that had taken off with his money? He gets to see that ship attacked by pirates and it's sinking. So in other words, the message here is not that good is always results in evil, that good activities or good people are always treated badly, or that evil people always prosper. The world isn't that morally organized. Not only is it not run by God, it's not run by the devil. It's totally chaotic. So he gets the satisfaction of seeing his money and this kind of thieving captain go down to the bottom of the ocean, and they see some of the red sheep floating around. They bring them on, up on shore, and they're brought over to France. The red sheep are ultimately donated to the French Academy of Sciences, and someone works out an equation which shows they must be red and they must all die of whatever disease kills sheep. Right? I mean, it's a kind of a send-up of French intellectual life, which is ripe for satire. I mean, if you think of the ponderous qualities of it, works out very nicely. No one escapes criticism, or almost nothing escapes criticism in this book. Well, they get to France, and immediately he gets to see the best element in Parisian society, which is to say thieves and swindlers and cutthroats, who are mostly aristocrats. In other words, everyone is a hypocrite. Everyone is a liar. Everyone is out on the make, except the stupid people who are optimists. So we get the experienced evil people, right, who know what the deal is and constantly take advantage of dopey Candide, and we get optimistic people who constantly are the fodder for these kinds of folks. So he's taken advantage of it in a number of ways. He loses 50,000 livres in his first 10 minutes at the card table because he doesn't know what card sharking is. He meets a woman who seduces him, and it's a really funny passage because she says, I really do admire that giant diamond ring on your hand. And she admires it enough, she says, oh, take it, I got lots of them, they're rocks from El Dorado. And she says, usually I make my lovers linger for a full 2 weeks, but why don't we just go to bed directly? A kind of send-up of Parisian society, salon society. And then, of course, there's another priest that comes back in, and he's, of course, depraved and corrupt as well. He wants to hear what Candide's story is, because he figures there's got to be a few dollars in this for him. And he hears that he's searching for the wonderful Cunegonde, who's the best of all possible women. And he says, well, what happened to her? He said, well, I left her in Buenos Aires, and I haven't seen her since, but I sent Cacambo for her. She's supposed to be here any day. The priest is thinking, okay, we got a real live one here. So he says, fine. Cunegonde has just sent him a letter. I happen to have a letter from Cunegonde. Okay, that's a good coincidence, but dopey Candide, thinking the best of people, says, well, this must be the best of all possible letters, right? And this is the best of all possible coincidences. I happen to tell him the story, and the letter shows up the next day. It's beautiful. It's not in Cunegonde's hand, but perhaps her handwriting has changed over the years or over the time. Okay, so it turns out that Cunegonde is deathly ill and is in bed, and because she has a disease of the voice, her voice sounds somewhat different, and it'll be important for Candide not to see her. She's behind a veil in the bed, and what she would like is a large part of Candide's money. Candide gives it to her, okay, and then finds out that he's been taken, but it's too late then, the money's gone, and so is Cunegonde was never there, and the priest absconds with the money. Constant digs against organized religion. So they come back. And he says, this is not the kind of country I want to stay in. Let's go to a good country like England. Well, they set sail for England. They get into the English harbor, and the first thing they see is one of the things that actually happened to be happening in contemporary in England at the time. An admiral was executed for dereliction of duty. Now, it's widely thought that he didn't deserve this execution, but he was killed, and while Martin and Candide are still on the boat, Martin says, look, this is the way people act all the time. See, I told you. What do you expect? People are not the way Pangloss told you they are. And they see the admiral get killed, and they say, I don't even want to get off the boat here. I don't want to encounter these people. They killed that admiral for no good reason. Let's take off. Let's go to Venice. So they leave directly from England to Venice. And in there, they manage to see a happy couple. And the happy couple, of course, turn out to be a whore and a priest. I mean, it's unrelenting. And we're only 60 pages into this, right? I mean, it doesn't let up. And he says, finally, a happy couple, a whore and a priest. Isn't that adorable? And Martin says, no, they're not happy. And Candide says, they're definitely happy. And as soon as Candide says they're definitely anything, they're always definitely not that. And whenever Martin says no, they're not happy, Martin's always right, being the pessimistic philosopher, the opposite of Pangloss. And he says, we'll invite them to dinner, we'll have a little chat with them. Well, the whore is wretched and miserable. She doesn't like being a prostitute. She just happens to be forced by necessity into this. The priest says, look, I didn't ask to be a priest. I'm a younger son of an aristocratic family. There's no other way for me to live. I can't get an inheritance. I'm, primogeniture rules here. So I had to enter the church. But I hate the church. I hate this life. I'm not a real priest. I have no religious calling. And I'm constantly consorting with whores. There's nothing between us. It's just she's a whore and I'm a priest, and that's the way it is. And, of course, Candide pays off Martin, says, all right, and Martin's thinking, well, look, it's a shame this kid's so dumb. On the other hand, I'm going to make a few dollars out of this because every bet I win. Constant pessimism, constant negativity. Now, fortunately, while in Venice, they managed to meet a number of interesting people. In the first case, they meet Cacambo, who's back. Remember, we left him in South America on his way to get Cunegonde? Well, he's been enslaved, and so is Cunegonde. And they're back in Turkey now. They're at Constantinople. And they happen, fortunately for us, Cacambo happens, fortunately for us, to be in Venice. And what happens there is he says, fine, we're going to go, I have a little extra money. We're going to go rescue all the captives who are held by the Turks. So that's one of their projects. They send Cacambo back to arrange that. Second thing that they encounter is I think it's either 6 or 10 dethroned kings. In other words, they've come to Venice for the carnival, and these men are completely wretched. So amidst all the carnival atmosphere, all the frivolity and all the hilarity and all the pleasure and all the joy, we have wretched people, right? Which is a very bitter description of the human world. Beneath all our frivolity is a sort of forced happiness, or rather just a veneer of happiness, which covers over, in fact, the world as moral chaos. And most of us are wretched or stupid. Those are your choices. Harsh. Well, they also get a chance to dine with Senator Poco-Curante, right? The Venetian, a Venetian senator, politically influential, exceedingly wealthy, who lives a life of luxury. And they say, finally, Candide is much relieved, finally, we have the best of all possible Venetian senators. And he must live the best of all possible lives, because look at this beautiful house. If anybody been to Venice, what a beautiful city. You can see how someone could really settle down there and think, okay, this may be a chaotic world, but this is kind of nice. So they make a bet. Martin and Candide say, all right, well, here, I got somebody that's really happy, who's, deserves the pleasure that they get. Well, no, doesn't work out that way. Poco-Curante says, well, actually, I'm bored to tears. I've read all the great works of Western literature, and I suppose there are a few chapters in the Iliad that are all right. Apart from that, they're a real snooze. They're overdone, and it's constantly repetitive. And if I hear any more about rosy-fingered dawn, I'm just going to go nuts. I can't cope with this anymore. I have great masterpieces of Renaissance art hanging all over my building, and I have wonderful classical sculptures, and I find all of them tedious. In other words, he's a jaded intellectual aesthete who has everything a man could want in terms of family life, home life, political power, the ability to absorb beauty, kind of highly sensitized, highly developed aesthetic taste. He's bored to tears. As Kierkegaard says, boredom is the root of all evil. Well, Senator Poco-Curante, who I think represents the views held by Voltaire himself, in other words, this may be a way of alleviating his own boredom, his own ennui. Turns out that Martin's making a few dollars. Every bet that he makes, it turns out that we find unhappy people. You scratch the surface, you see human misery everywhere. Well, off they go to Constantinople. They rescue Cunegonde. And by now, Cunegonde is pretty weather-beaten. She's gotten old. She's become ugly. She's really unattractive. And now that Candide has her, he no longer wants her. Think about blighted hopes, thwarted aspirations. Everybody gets what they don't want. Harsh ironies here. Also, they managed to find, once again, Pangloss is back. This best of all possible worlds sends Pangloss back. He's been arrested for making sexual advances to a Muslim girl in a mosque, which shows his great religiosity. So he's been stuck on the galleys. And also, fortunately for us, we had thought that Candide had killed Cunegonde's brother, but no. He recovers from his wounds, and he's in the galleys, and it turns out the same galley that Pangloss is in, except that he's in the galley for sodomy. So our Jesuit, would-be ruler of Paraguay, who is in fact an aristocrat and Candide's brother, has not been killed. He's just been brought back so that he can be accused of sexual transgressions as well. Well, he decides to ransom them all. You know, after all, money is cheap and easy for Candide. He has a few dollars to spend, even though he's lost a good bit of it to Martin. And he decides, fine, let's take them all. You know, so he rescues the captives. And he says, I suppose now I'm going to marry Cunegonde. And he doesn't want Cunegonde anymore. She's ugly. She's old. I mean, she's been a prostitute. And he's starting to get the idea that this may not be the best of all possible worlds. He's not entirely sure. And they happen to ask a Muslim dervish, a clergyman, what's the word on God's providence? Is it the best of all possible worlds or not? And the dervish gives very great wisdom. I think this is the voice of Voltaire himself, saying, God is essentially indifferent to us. The actual point he makes is, what does he say? When the Sultan sends a ship to Egypt, does he care about the happiness of the mice on board? We are the mice on board the vessel of the world, except that we're not quite as interesting or significant as rodents. An exceedingly harsh comment on the lack of moral order, lack of kind of ethical structure to the world. In other words, this is an anti-theodicy. Now, I'm going to finish this all up. What do we do with this? Because, I mean, they've been traipsing around the world for quite a bit now. For 100 pages, we've gotten quite a bit of geography done. And they decide that they're going to settle down. They see a man who has a small farm. He keeps working there. And this work prevents him from the three main evils in human life. And these three main evils are boredom, vice, and want. He says, look, I have this little plot of land. It's not a big farm, but by cultivating my garden, by not making general philosophical pronouncements about God's intentions for the world, by not trying to redeem God's justice, by not trying to understand God's purposes, at least I can find a tolerable sort of existence. I cultivate my gardens. I grow oranges. I like oranges. Oranges are the kind of thing that human beings can sensibly aspire to. Understanding God's purposes should be left alone. Anyone who tries to do that is likely to cause more problems for themselves than they manage to alleviate. So we get this man who comes as close to human virtue and human happiness as we can imagine. He has no ambition. He has no horizons beyond the borders of his farm, and that's about all you're going to get in life. So Voltaire buys a plot, or not Voltaire, but Candide buys a plot of land and says, let's all live together. We will cultivate our garden. I will marry Cunegonde, and we'll make the best of what we have here. Well, the brother, who is very proud of his aristocratic lineage, says, under no circumstances are you going to marry my sister. Now remember who we have here. He's a priest who's also homosexual, who's just recently been rescued from the galleys where he deserved to be by the kindness of Candide. He says, back to the galleys with you. That's all there is to that. And the next thing he does is he marries Cunegonde, but not because he desires her anymore. He marries her out of spite. Oh, man. In other words, a constantly negative interpretation of the human condition, a constantly ironic set of turns of events. And they get married, and they decide to cultivate their garden. And at the end of it, what we conclude is that we must work without philosophizing. It is the only way that makes life bearable. In other words, Pangloss can stay as long as he shuts up and stops telling me this is the best of all possible worlds. This world is just barely tolerable if we stop thinking about what it really amounts to. Now stop and think about what an ironic conclusion that is. In other words, the only way to make life bearable is not to think about it. If you think about it, you realize that it's a dead end, that it's morally chaotic, that whether you prosper or not has nothing to do with whether you're good or not, that God is not in his heaven and all is not right with the world. The conclusion of this is as pessimistic an assessment of the human condition as you're going to see. The lightness of tone and the elegance of the writing in this novel is extremely deceptive. The first time you read it, particularly if you read it outside the context of what's going on in the late part of the Enlightenment, you can think of this as just a comic novel, as just kind of a bagatelle. It's actually very, very serious. This is the sort of thing we might expect from Poco-Curante, right, when he's in his blackest moods. Right? Voltaire then has a considerable amount of venom in this conclusion. He not only wants to cure us of optimism the way Candide is cured, he also wants us to understand that the best human beings can hope for is a kind of oblivion, a kind of constant work which at least takes up the time until you die. Elsewise, it's only going to make things worse. The attempt to say this is the best of all possible worlds makes this world as bad as it can be. Optimism, or pessimism in a way, is its own reward. Optimism always gets its comeuppance, or it gets its comeuppance often enough so that the best and most prudent and sensible and realistic approach to life is not to think about what life amounts to. We must live without philosophizing. At the time, and I'll conclude with this, by 1758, when this novel is published, the Enlightenment is clearly waning. It's been on for a century or so at that time, and the faith and optimistic hope that rationality will allow us to control nature and control ourselves has proven illusory. This is the Enlightenment kind of looking back on itself and on the optimism that is characteristic of the scientific rationalism we see developing, which says, no, we should stop thinking. We should kind of give up on these grandiose schemes which account for God's ways. It's the only way that makes life bearable. What we are seeing here is the gradual erosion in the faith that in the faith and reason that have been characteristic of the Enlightenment, that it sustained the Enlightenment thinkers. And as that faith and reason erodes, as this pessimism becomes more important, we are moving towards a literary articulation of our dissatisfaction with the Enlightenment. And the result of that is going to be called Romanticism.